Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone to our 2021 event planning session. Thank you so much for joining us. Just to let you know, we do plan for this to hopefully be a fairly interactive session. So it would be great if you have the bandwidth, if you could go on video when you're speaking. We'll be kind of going back and forth between screen sharing and discussion. So maybe when we're in discussion, if you're able to go on video, that would be great. I also wanted to let you know that we will be recording the session just to make sure that we can capture everything that gets discussed. We will be doing taking notes as well. As you know, the work groups hold a variety of events every year, and usually at least 2, although this last year we did 4 events. This meeting is basically your opportunity to help shape the events that we hold to make sure that they are responsive to your interests. For the agenda, we will be starting with some introductions here in just a minute. And then, we'll be reflecting a bit on the events we held last year, and we will share the results of the survey that we posted that will indicate where people's interest and energy lies. Then for the top 4 topics that were identified per the survey, we'll start getting into some of the nitty-gritty of outlining what a potential sessions might look like and next steps for each of those. And we'll do some brainstorming around possible event formats. And then we'll just close with a few updates. So to start, if we could just go around and do introductions and give your name, your organization, or your role, because I know not everybody is with an organization. And then also, if you could share the first food that you ever grew and the first food you ever grew yourself and ate. And if you haven't done that, the food that you would like to grow for yourself to eat. So I can start. I'm Sabrina Ambergy from SID-US. In addition to being the co-chair for this work group, I also work on strategic growth and partnerships for SID-US. And the first food that I remember growing and eating was strawberries in our backyard when I was a little kid. I think to facilitate things, I will just call out, I'll go through the names and call on people, and then I'll just do a check at the end to make sure I haven't missed anyone. So let's start with my co-chair, Mark.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mark Castellino. I'm the Vice President for Public Sector Business Development at Opportunity International. And also, as Sabrina said, I'm also the co-chair of this work group. And the first food that I ever recall growing and eating is our gooseberries. And we grew them in the bottom of my garden back in my home in England. And we turned them into gooseberry and apple pies. Though if you've ever eaten a gooseberry, you'll know they are extremely tart. So I think that we probably ate more sugar than we did gooseberries.
Great, thank you. Lisa Loxman, am I saying that correctly?
Yes, you are. Hi, I'm an independent consultant, a former federal employee of USDA NIFA. And so I grew up on a dairy farm in Kansas. So we always had a garden. And because it's approaching St. Patrick's Day, it just seems so fitting. We would plant potatoes, Irish cobblers. And you had to plant them either on St. Patty's Day or Good Friday. So that's what I recall. A lot of starchy foods in Kansas.
Great, thank you. Mike Simpson.
Absolutely. I'm currently a student at Columbia Business School, but before school worked for the UN World Food Program and in the Marine Corps in a humanitarian capacity. So very interested in returning to that work post school. And first food ever grew up in New Jersey, so tomatoes were pretty big for the family.
Great, thank you. Megan Dixon.
Hey there. So I'm a program associate intern with the Society for International Development in Washington, D.C. And I believe that the first food that I ever had grown was oranges.
Impressive. Great. Melina Reynoso.
Hi, everyone. My name is Melina. I'm a program associate with SID Washington as well. And my family has always had nopales growing in our backyard, which is great for different meals and snacks and stuff.
Great, thanks. Jamal Seaforth.
Hey everyone, I'm Jamal. I'm the events administration coordinator at SID, and the first food I remember growing was mangoes back in my home country of Guyana.
Nice. Shabnam Kabir.
Hi everyone, this is Shabnam. I'm also a program associate here at SID-W, and I don't think I've ever grown any food.
If you could, what would you grow?
Probably mangoes, because I love mangoes.
Great, thanks. Paul Sherman.
No, wasn't expecting. Paul Sherman, I'm the director of programs for SID-W. So if there are any questions about SID, I am happy to answer them.
Thanks, Paul. Afsana, hi.
Hi, yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Afsana. I am currently I'm a contractor with the Water and Energy for Food Grand Challenge at USAID. And growing up in New York City, I didn't have a chance to grow anything, but if I could, I would definitely love to grow some strawberries.
Okay, Genzo Yamamoto, not sure if I'm mangling your name, sorry.
Yeah, it's Genzo. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I grew up in suburban Tokyo, so we didn't have land that's right next to our house or anything like that, but my parents rented this plot of land, this little kind of postage stamp kind of garden land, and we grew Japanese vegetables, which of course as a kid wasn't very exciting to me, but kale, cucumber, Japanese pumpkin.
Great, thanks. Daphne Jean.
Hello, good morning. I am a fundraiser. I currently work for a women's rights advocacy organization, but for the past year, I've been doing a lot of research about market system and food and agriculture. So I'm very excited to be here today. I grew up in Haiti, and my grandparents were farmers, and I recall visiting them once and eating like tomatoes and avocado, and still till today, that was like the best tomato and avocado I've ever had. But I've never grown anything, but if I had to grow something, I think I'm gonna go with avocados.
Those are great. Okay, thanks. Paul Koch.
Hello, my name is Paul Cook, and I'm an independent consultant now in the Washington, D.C. area. I'm also an on-call employee with a small consulting firm in Virginia. My prior activity in food and agriculture internationally was with a 2-year fellowship with the State Department that ended a couple of years ago. And I'm eager to get back into conversation about those concerns. As a kid, my first recollection of growing food was growing peas on a garden plot that my parents rented outside Iowa City called Cedar Rapids. Given my little subplot of our family plot, I chose peas one year and I think beets the other.
Great. Start pea season again, I think. Rebecca, I think it's Chambers, but it's cutting off.
Yeah, it's Rebecca Chamberlain. So I'm actually also from Iowa, so happy to have another Iowan on the call. I'm from Des Moines. Currently working at Commonics International. I'm a senior associate on the agriculture and food security practice. And I think the first thing I can remember growing is probably lettuce.
Great, thanks. Jenny Morgan. Jenny, you're on mute if you're.
Sorry about that. I was taking the call from my phone. So now you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. My name's Jenny Morgan. I work at Mercy Corps, and I'm working on resilience and food security, and also on a couple of USAID learning awards. One's called the REAL Award that looks at resilience measurement, and the other one is IDEAL. So it's implementer capacity building award with implementers of food security programs. Let's see, I grew up in Alabama, so there we had a lot of space. And I do recall my parents always had a garden that we actually had to fence off from deer and other things that would come and eat everything. My mom let us kind of plant whatever we wanted. I remember throwing watermelon seeds in the ground, or, you know, just whatever we felt like making. Sorry, that's my son in Zoom school upstairs. My mom's from Mexico, and this is really embarrassing because she asked me to go pick the cilantro from the garden, which I should have known what it was. She used it all the time. And instead I cut the carrot tops off. And she doesn't let me forget that. But right now I have a little urban garden. I'm based in DC. I just containers mostly. But it's been fun doing that with my son. So anyway.
Great, thank you. Yeah, you can actually do quite a lot in containers.
Yeah, I do.
Okay, Michelle Kurian. You're unmuted.
Okay. Michelle, I'm part of a new social enterprise working in agricultural development in Zambia. I was previously part of SID-W just as a member. And first thing I remember growing was actually watermelon, but it was accidental. I spit out the seeds in my mom's rose garden, and the watermelon sprouted up, and she was unhappy about that.
That's some very fertile soil there. Looks like we were joined, I think this is a new person, Aparna Arora. If you could just introduce yourself with your name and your organization or your role, and then we're just sharing the first food that you ever grew or ate, or if you haven't done that, what food you would like to grow to eat yourself.
Sure, thank you so much, Sabrina. I'm Aparna. I'm a graduate student at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. I haven't ever grown any food, but I would love to learn to grow some herbs, which I can use for my pasta or pizza dishes. And those happen to be my favorite foods as well these days. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I think I might have missed Jamal Seaforth.
No, I think you did cover Jamal. I think you covered everyone. I think that's great. Well, it's thanks very much, Sabrina. It's excellent to meet everyone, as well as to hear a little bit about some of your work and your agricultural skills, your agronomy skills. So I really appreciate you all joining us for this event. What we'll do next, and I'll just share the screen again. Hopefully you can all see that. Is we'll just do an overview of the events that we conducted in 2020 last year. And to just both kind of have a celebration about what it was a wonderful year of events, as well as to just help to give you an idea about some of the things that we've already done, how we've kind of constructed these topics, and can help to shape our thinking as we go into a discussion around what topics we should cover for this coming year. So the first work group event that we had for the year was an event that we called the Rising Importance of Resilience in Food Security. And this was back in February the 13th, we held it. And it was the only in-person event that we were able to do last year before the lockdown and before we moved fully over to virtual events. But if you work in the US government funding circles, then you're probably very familiar with the fact that USAID stood up a new bureau. The previous Bureau for Food Security became the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security. And so there was this elevation of the focus on resilience in USAID's work in food security and agriculture. And so we thought it would be really timely to do an event that talked about this rising prominence of resilience. why these trends were happening, what was both happening within USAID with this elevation and what it would mean for food security and agriculture programming from USAID, as well as some of the broader context of resilience. And so we had an excellent event. I moderated a panel that included the director for the Center of Resilience, which was a new center created as part of the standing up of the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security, Christine Gottschalk. We also had Julie Howard from CSIS and Olga Petriniak, Jenny, your colleague, and I heard you mentioned that you are also working in resilience. And we had a great discussion about the work that Mercy Corps is doing, as well as some of the policy issues in resilience from Julie's perspective, and then the kind of funding and donor implementation side with Christine. So that was a great event. From there, we moved over to virtual events for the rest of our year. And the next event that we had was in May. And this was a joint event that we did with the Young Professionals Network at SID. And it kind of came out of a recognition that, you know, there are those of us in our work group that are focused on international agriculture and food security, but we were also seeing here in DC and in the broader Metro DC area, a massive impact on household food insecurity as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we wanted to do an event that's perhaps a bit different to what we would normally do, focused exclusively on international work, but one that looked at the effects of the pandemic, both internationally on the food security work that we're doing around the world, as well as here in our own neighborhoods in DC. And so we had a panel that was moderated by Rebecca Middleton, who was the executive director for the Alliance to End Hunger. And she was really well positioned for this because the Alliance does food security and agriculture policy, both domestic policy and international policy. So she was able to lead a really good discussion that focused on both areas. We had Jim Flock, the chief of party for ACDI-VOCA's Nafaka 2 project being implemented in Tanzania, as well as the heads of 3 really great organizations in the DC area that are providing food security services here. Kim Ford from Martha's Table, Radha Mithia from Capital Area Food Bank, and Carrie Stoltzfus from Food and Friends. And so we talked not only about the way that that COVID-19 is impacting food insecurity globally, but we also heard some really practical ways that we could, and our members in SID could support some of the work that's happening here in our own community, and the insecurity that was really causing significant issues in communities here at home. So that was a great event. We moved on in October to implement implement an event that we've been planning for quite some time, and it was really focused on young women leaders in agriculture and food security in Africa. And we really wanted to take advantage of the opportunity that we were presented with moving virtual to create an event that provided a space for voices that were not just here in the DC area, but a topic that really allowed us to bring in people from specifically from Africa to share some experiences directly working in agriculture and food security in the field. We had a panel that was co-moderated by Christina Manfrey from TechnoServe and Joyce Muchena from the MasterCard Foundation. And they led a conversation with 3 women who were doing quite diverse careers in agriculture and food security, from the finance perspective with Sandra Namalondo from the Opportunity Bank of Uganda Limited, Maria Nagadiri, who is a young woman who has created an ag startup in Uganda, and Awasanu, who has carved out a career in ag policy. And so it was really great to hear how these women were creating diverse careers in agriculture and food security, and how, you know, the opportunities that existed for women in an industry that has not necessarily been particularly well represented for women, and hopefully showing a future of agriculture and food security that was really open to women having a range of diverse careers and opportunities. And then we rounded out the year with an event on agricultural innovation. And this is another example of how we were able to kind of utilize this virtual format to bring in some voices from around the world. We partnered with SID Israel, and we focused on the work that the Israeli Research and Development Agricultural Research and Development Institution, Volcani, has been doing in promoting some of the innovations that they have developed in Israel, and then really expanding that around the world. And it kind of started with this report that Volcani International Partnerships had developed in partnership with AGRA to extend some of the experience that Israel has had on the policy side with the work that AGRA is doing with African governments to kind of create the policy environment where innovation can happen. And they were also joined on the panel by Elissa Burrows, who is from a USAID-funded project that specifically looks at ways of financing agricultural innovation, the Feed the Future Partnering for Innovation project that is implemented by FinTrack. And the panel was moderated by Laurie Gross-Rowley from the Luga Center, who she leads the Global Food Security and Aid Effectiveness project there. So another fantastic event that really brought a number of different perspectives. And I just wanted to make a few observations from the events that we did last year that I think are kind of worth us thinking about as we're planning out events for this coming year. One is representation. I think last year we achieved something that I think is very good. We had a really good diversity of representation on the panel and moderators that we had in our events. Of the 19 panelists and moderators, 4 were men and 15 were women. So we had really great representation of women. Particularly, there was one event that was specifically focused on women. So that kind of really helped us to have a good representation of women. But I think it was very good that we were able to get a diversity of gender in our events. We had, I think, very good ethnic diversity in our panelists and moderators. Over 40% of those involved in our events were people of color. And we had a really good diversity of age and experience. We had a range of people in different stages of their careers. And I think that this is important to recognize that, you know, our SID membership is made up of people in very different stages of their careers. And it's important, I think, that when we're creating events, we're thinking about how we can make sure that we're representing those ranges as well. And one thing that I kind of touched on in a couple of those events that had gone virtual is that we were able to really touch on a key issue of inclusivity and development, which is that the virtual format allowed us to have really great representation from the places that we work. We had panelists from Kenya, from Uganda, from Burkina Faso, and from Rwanda. So I think that representation was one thing that really kind of struck me about the events that we created last year. Another is that we tried to ensure that the events capture some of the important things that are happening both in our sector and in the world. So, you know, we touched on an event that was specifically focused on COVID-19, which was, you know, will always be the theme of 2020 for us as it goes down in history, as well as we were also able to kind of capture some of the things that were happening in our sector, like the standing up of the new Bureau for Resilience and Food Security at USAID. And then lastly, my last observation is that we took advantage of the virtual environment to really expand participation. And as we think about 2021, the reality is that we will still be planning virtual events. And so that's something that hopefully we can also kind of harness and take advantage of as we move forward. So that's a quick overview of the events that we did in 2020. And I'll hand over to Sabrina to go through some of the results of the member survey that we sent out before this planning event.
Thank you, Mark. Great. So as I mentioned, we had posted this survey for a while in preparation for this workshop. We had 10 respondents. The questions were geared towards getting an understanding of the areas of interest that could be shaped into potential events. The survey began with asking members to rank a series of topics in order of interest. The graph on the left, the bars show the overall average ranking, and then the kind of shaded area behind shows the degree of agreement or consensus in the scoring. So as you can see, private sector engagement received the highest ranking and quite high consensus, followed by diversifying rural economies for resilience, then safe and nutritious food systems, and fourth was agricultural financial technology or finance technology. Areas that came in lower were food loss and waste, food security in an urbanizing world, precision ag, and smallholder farmers and the American consumer. We also had a write-in section where members could suggest additional topics that they would be interested in. Some of the ideas that came up included ways to transition farmers out of subsistence farming, a couple of different topics related to the impacts of COVID, solving the missing middle in ag finance, so related similar to the other ag finance topic, bringing a consumer focus to agricultural value chains, and moving women and youth up the value chain into roles beyond just production. Also mentioned was cross-border trade in informal markets, agriculture R&D, and international aid and agriculture markets. So some interesting ideas. We kind of took both the ranking results and then the write-in suggestions and came up with four topics that are mostly the three top rankings, and then we broadened the agricultural fintech. Mark will go into those. What we're going to do in a bit is talk about how we can kind of flesh those out, where specifically within those broad areas we want to focus some events. But Mark will go into these topics with you.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Sabrina. So these are the top four topics, and we're going to spend the bulk of our time brainstorming these four topics: agriculture finance, private sector engagement, safe and nutritious food systems, and diversifying rural economies for increased resilience. But I'll just go back to talk a little bit about how workgroup events are created, how these things happen. And there are really three pieces here. One is that it's driven by workgroup members, and so that's really what we're here to do today. And so there are probably two really important reasons for that. One is it ensures that events are based on what all of you are interested in rather than just what we are interested in. And so having this kind of broad participation of workgroup members and having the events really spearheaded by all of you allows us to make sure that these are relevant to what you're interested in. And the second is that it provides opportunities to bring in a broader set of voices, both in the ideation as we're planning this out, as well as we're thinking about what goes into those topics. So suggesting panelists, for example, I think it's really great that we have a diverse range of people speaking into the design of this, so that when we create these events, they really do share they present a broad set of voices, more than just a couple of individuals might be able to kind of scheme up ourselves. And so that's one thing. So when we think about what we're going to do over the rest of our time, we'll be going through brainstorming the event topics, as well as identifying key people among you to drive forward the organization of each of these 4 topics. The second is that it's supported by the work group chairs, by me and Sabrina. So we help to provide the broad parameters in which we'll organize these events, which is like this planning session is one example of that. We help to manage the timeline to make sure that event planning stays on track, so that we can make sure that we do get these events organized and conducted this year. And then we also provide support in suggesting ways to engage more participants and panelists, kind of helping flesh out and supporting workgroup members as you organize these events. And then the third area of contribution is SID-W. So the SID-W staff, several of them you've seen on with us today on this call, they really provide us with great support on the logistics of organizing these events. So they support all of the technology needs, and particularly as we're planning virtual events, and that's a key thing for us over this particular medium, as well as when we are in person. There's a lot of technology issues that they need to sort out. When we are in person as well, they also arrange the physical locations, and we typically have work group events in their office space. They do all the promotion of the events, and they also help with the coordination of event sponsorship, particularly for the in-person events. There's the opportunity for sponsorship there as well. Sometimes we might organize an event around a lunch, for example, or an afternoon, evening event that has maybe a happy hour afterwards or something like that. So that's kind of how we go about organizing the event. And the key thing for us to do today is to really start to flesh out some ideas around these 4 topics. Hopefully there is a topic in there that resonates with each of you, that you might feel an area to contribute towards or feel passionate about. And so we'll go through a discussion on each of those topics, and we'll by the end of our discussion, we will hopefully have a general idea of how within that broader topic, what particular area we're going to focus on, as well as we will have identified people who are going to move forward with organizing, with fleshing out all of the rest of the plans for the event. Hopefully at least 2 people per event. We found that to be a good number moving forward. It's always good to have at least one other person to bounce ideas off. If there are more than 2 people who are interested in a particular event, that is great. But hopefully we can get at least 2 people for each of these events that we've got outlined here. And then those organizers will be tasked with going away and doing the further organizing, identifying panelists, looking at the learning objectives of the event, thinking about the particular format that we might use, and then the work group co-chairs will support them in organizing that, and then we'll get it into the hopper and hopefully arrange a time for the event to happen. So let's move on to start our brainstorming on these event topics. And I'm going to stop sharing now so that we can hopefully see each other a bit more as we have this discussion. But we're going to take each of these 4 topics in order, and we'll start off with agriculture finance. So this is really the interactive portion of our planning session. And I'd love to hear from you about any thoughts around that particular topic, which directions we might want to take that in, and how you might be interested in being involved in organizing that. So agriculture finance, please feel free to share your ideas and thoughts on this particular topic. I've also got some guiding questions that you may also be interested in, but I see, Michelle, you've unmuted, so please go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted more clarity on the question. Are you speaking more about investment for larger ag companies in the global south? Are you talking about smallholder microfinance, impact investing, or the whole gamut?
So this is, I think, really up to us. But some of the things, Sabrina mentioned one of the areas that did come back in in the survey that we sent out that one of the respondents was particularly interested was new developments in ag fintech. So that could be a potential approach in terms of whether we're talking about like specifically smallholder finance, if we're thinking of SME finance. I think that's really up to us to determine which areas do you feel particularly passionate about, or which direction would you like this to go in?
This is Lisa, and I was just going to say it seems interesting that, you know, we're looking at diversifying rural economies, which could lead to a conversation about ag finance, which also, if we're looking at ultimately that we want to be resilient with safe and nutritious food systems, there's a way to weave this topic, potentially taking it like the look of a Rubik's Cube in some respects and how they all fit together. But that just becomes, you know, for who are we trying to present to? Are we trying to engage the broader SID community in the conversation? Because if we're talking to ourselves, I mean, that's part of my, you know, trying to understand in that, because it seemed like the topics from the year before brought in a broad range that potentially could speak to some of the other groups. You know, just asking.
Yeah, that's a really good point that you raised. So just on one of those topics that you mentioned there about kind of maybe bringing in some of the other groups, one of the things that we have done in the past is to do joint events with other work groups. And one question that I had for this group as we think about ag finance is whether we see the potential for an overlap with another work group. For example, one thing that we might want to consider is one of the things that has happened in the last year and a half is the standing up of the Development Finance Corporation and the tools that that corporation now has in providing a range of different financing opportunities. Perhaps an interesting angle for ag finance might be to consider the role and capabilities that the DFC has in financing agriculture. And if we were to take it in that direction, then it might make sense for us to do a joint event with the Development Finance Work Group. So that's a possibility. I don't want to kind of capture the conversation here and lead it in a particular direction, but I wanted to present that as a potential opportunity for us and get your interest in whether that's a direction you'd like to go in or if there are any other thoughts.
Mark, I know that in conversations I've heard of the good work that SID does, but I'm relatively new to this forum. In past events, can I ask how many people showed up? And yeah, that would give us a sense of audience as well. Sorry if this is just a remedial question.
No, absolutely. So so just in terms of the type of people who come to our events, they tend to be a pretty diverse range. And so we do have a lot of development practitioners working in organizations implementing implementing agriculture and food security projects around the world. We have a number of people who come from kind of a research and background, a policy background, and then we also have some good participation from donors, particularly in the DC area, USAID, as well as some of the international institutions here. And so we get a good range. So I should also mention we do have a number of students who also come to our events as well. And I know that we've got a couple of people who are studying here on the call as well. And so it's great to have that kind of participation. Numbers-wise, in-person events have been usually more well attended than the virtual events. And the reality for this year is that we're going to have primarily virtual events. And our event at the beginning of the year that was in person, we had 61 people who attended that. The COVID-19 event, which was online, was we had 50 people attend. And then the final 2 events of the year, both virtual as well, and we had 29 people attend each of those. So the numbers do vary. I think that, you know, obviously there are some topics that are going to be more interesting than others for people to attend. But yeah, we have that kind of range of probably around from 30 to 60 people attend any given event.
So at the risk of saying things that are just obvious to everyone, you know, if we're talking about agricultural finance, I think the general category that we place under innovations, anything that people think is innovative, it would be nice to catch us all up. That's one idea. Another thing that strikes me from a knowledge management point of view is that we've often talked about smallholder farmers, but I don't think we have a full grasp of how rural economies function. I don't know if that's relevant or not, but I find myself curious. Is ag finance to smallholders sufficient to stimulate the rural economy? Can we just be comfortable with that or not? And maybe the answer is yes. You know, ag finance to farmers is sufficient, but it's a question mark for me. The other perhaps is I know that in our organizations sometimes we talk about how is there a way, you know, we're not really talking about a graduation program, but is there a pathway that we expect smallholder farmers to be able to walk or a journey to take when we talk about ag finance? For whatever it's worth, 3 ideas.
This is Jenny. I just had a question about partnering with other organizations, because, you know, there's lots of folks that work on all of these areas and are also doing a whole slate of events. And so, I mean, you obviously pull in lots of different speakers and panelists, but what about actually doing joint events? Is that something you do?
Joint events with other organizations?
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe that we have, but when we think about the composition of our the participants in our events, the panelists and moderators, they are definitely from a diverse range of organizations. And so, you know, as an example, we had Julie Howard from CSIS on the resilience panel, and you know, CSIS does an excellent, you know, their food security, their global food security project does some really in-depth policy research work that results in some really excellent events and reports that they publish. And so, you know, in that context, we had somebody from another organization that does some really good things in this space, but, you know, we're obviously the ones who are hosting this event. So I think that there's really good opportunity for participation. And I think that as we think about how to flesh out a particular topic, one of the things that we do start thinking about as soon as possible are who are the people who could be involved in the event as moderators or panelists. And so I think that that's SID, I think, has always been open to a very broad range of participation. Certainly, it's not restricted to just SID members. And in fact, I think that we're really encouraged by SID to have that breadth of participation, because they really do enjoy having you know, new organizations and new people involved in the work that they're doing.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it was more about just kind of joining forces to, you know, market some of these events, or, you know, increase the sort of number of people that may come, or just, you know, people have different ways they reach their members or folks who are part of their programs. But
yeah, and that also touches on another really a good point, in that, you know, being a DC-based chapter, SID Washington, you know, there is a huge focus on USAID. Most of the people in this town are doing something with the US government. And so one of the things that we do find is that an event that is, that perhaps has a panelist or participation from USAID, tends to get a lot of traction. We tend to get more people participating in it, and so part of it is just because that's what we're all focused on. Part of it might be that it gets a bit more publicity as well. So that's certainly something to think about when we're thinking about the panelists who we want to participate in this. We definitely want them to promote it on their channels as well, so that we do get as much participation as possible.
So I'll also chime in on the partnerships part. This is Paul Sherman from SID, the SID-W. Just on behalf of SID, it's a little bit complicated doing partnerships with other organizations, because it falls under more what my colleagues do with membership. So we'd have to, that's a little bit more involvement on their end. But as Mark kind of hinted at, it's a little bit tricky, just because at the end of the day, it is SID's event. So sometimes we have to work with other organizations. Not to say that we wouldn't do it. We have done it in the past. But there are just a few more bureaucratic hurdles that we need to go through to make that happen. So there are just some things we have to think about a little bit more if we do something like that. It's just a little, obviously it's just, easier if we just kind of can keep it within SID and we just can kind of keep it moving forward, and it'll be, things will just kind of sort themselves out, but we can do it. It's just going to be a little bit more complicated in the long term, but it wouldn't necessarily prevent us from doing something like that.
Thanks, Paul. So Genzo shared a few ideas of potential directions that we could take this event. One was just a broad topic on innovations in ag finance that allows us to capture a number of different potentials on that. Another is ag finance sufficient to stimulate the rural economy? And then the third is there a pathway to that we expect smallholder farmers to take when we're providing ag finance to them? Is there a very kind of clear number of steps along the way that we expect ag finance to help smallholder farmers to achieve? Do any of those resonate with the group here? Any other thoughts on different ideas, or any ones that you're kind of starting to see some ideas around?
Mark, I know I've spoken, but just to avoid the awkward silence, I'll go ahead and chime in and say the last one, particularly because that's a lot of the work that I do nowadays. And, my past work in agricultural development and the gaps that I saw led me to realize that there's just not enough of a pathway or enough opportunities for smallholder microfinance in so many countries. I will have to say, because I was participating in a few other events over the last few years, I think it's like a fine balance that Washington has to play, where you can make the topic really broad, and then people who are actually specialists in that field, in that space, might not want to join because the topic is too broad. But then when you narrow it, then you get a lot of more interesting conversation instead. This is what microfinance is about. This is happening. And I think that applies to any space, whether you're talking about HIV/AIDS or like water sanitation. You need to find a nice balance of being in depth enough where you capture some of the people who want to learn.
Yeah, thanks very much, Michelle. By the way, awkward silences are really helpful for encouraging people to participate. So I'm really glad that you were prompted by that. Really good point that you raise. One of the things that we found as we organize these events is that, even if the topic may start off somewhat broad, as we start identifying particular panelists and a moderator, and as they become more involved in the planning, it perhaps helps us to refine the topic and turn it into something a bit more specific. So maybe having some breadth in there is pretty useful, so that as we craft it, it does kind of allow some room for the expertise of the panelists to help to shape that a little.
I'm just going to throw out that I think also the pathway for smallholder farmers is a pertinent one to look at from a return on investment. And part of it gets into the challenges and the obstacles and policies and practices. Because like, you know, in Pakistan alone, they want to keep them as smallholder farmers, but yet the reality check is maybe they're just never going to be able to get out of the realm of subsistence and support because the size is limited and what you can, you know, and that's an angle I think that definitely needs to be looked at, because certainly here in the US, it's transformed what farming looks like. And having grown up on what I would have considered a small farm aren't really small in the grand scheme of things. So it's that kind of conversation. It lends itself to then what innovative practices in financing would be of interest, and where to which is, you know, where does it become that point where it's not a pathway any longer?
Excellent. So I think that we've had a good amount of conversation on this one. We do have another 3 topics to cover. But last of all, we've heard, I think, some coalescing around this, this issue of pathways for smallholder farmers. And a few people have commented on that. Are any of you interested in working on organizing and fleshing out this topic further? Bearing in mind, this is the key next step. We've got a yes from Michelle. 1 or 2 more people particularly interested in this topic?
I'll volunteer.
Excellent. Daphne, thank you. Okay, so we've got 2 people. We're going to circulate all of this afterwards. If you feel that you would like to be more involved after you've had a chance to go through some of these other topics as well, then you'll certainly have another chance to let me know about your interest and involvement in that. And so let's move on to the next topic, and Sabrina's going to lead that. That is the private sector engagement topic.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Mark. Right, just before I start that, I would also note that in the survey write-in section, there's at least one person, and I think maybe more than that, who did kind of touch on this topic of transitioning farmers out of subsistence farming. So if that ends up being kind of part of this topic, that person may be somebody to engage with as well, and we could look at the survey to find that out.
Excellent, thanks, Sabrina.
Okay, so private sector engagement, again, very broad topic, getting a lot of attention these days. Thinking about, you know, what direction do we want to take this? Where might we focus within this broad topic? You know, maybe think in your own work, what do you think is most exciting or interesting that's happening in this area that is getting, I think, more attention these days? Is there a specific challenge that you face in your work in this area that you might be interested in either exploring the challenge or hearing about solutions that people may have? Is there a particular thing you'd want to learn about with this? Where does this generate interest?
I'd be interested in looking into how private sector engagement in educational systems, finding the matches and the opportunities for engagement in agriculture, particularly for those who are either secondary or in technical vocational schools from a higher education perspective.
Okay, interesting.
On that one, Lisa, are you thinking about, when you're thinking about the role of the private sector, are you thinking about kind of pathways to employment from secondary and TVET education?
That's one angle. And we could also be looking at how do we get employers involved with looking at the competencies and matching better? Because, you know, it seems like there's the mismatch that's occurring between those who get educated and then supplying the workforce. So I don't know, maybe somebody's got a really good way of doing that, handling it, but.
Maybe to piggyback on that idea, you know, I think one of the results on the survey was the missing middle. And the issue is how can, you know, we can deal with smallholder farmers and the growing of crops, but at what point can we begin to nurture food processing at however basic a level, so that there actually, there are crops that can be made into products that can be sold at the market at value add prices. Maybe that connects to other private sector interest, but maybe it doesn't. I'm not sure. But maybe the whole food processing side, and maybe that connects to the whole issue of schools. Um, yeah, maybe there's room for small businesses to be active. I'm not sure. I remember, I think this was in Guyana, I was talking to these farmers that were selling vegetables in a kiosk, and they were saying they were very proud, I remember, of ginger that they were growing, and they wanted me to taste it, said this is the best ginger that you can buy around. And they said, um, but you know, I said, oh, you can make various things, you know, candied ginger, you can make all sorts of things and actually sell it. But they didn't know what it was. They didn't know what to do with it and so on.
Yeah, I think that also could tie in a bit, again, with some of the ideas that came up through the survey and the open-ended. For instance, there was a suggestion on talking about how to better engage women in roles beyond production. So getting them involved higher up in the value chain. So exactly in that, in things like processing and value addition. I mean, not just that, but that could be one aspect of that as well. Any other ideas, comments? What about, you know, USAID this last year published their private sector engagement policy strategy. Is there interest in looking at that more deeply or hearing more about that? Okay, not hearing anybody else or seeing anybody else coming off of mute. Oh, Aparna?
Yeah, I was gonna say I would absolutely love to learn more about USAID's strategy. Another idea I had on this topic was how about connecting subsistence farmers to cooperatives, or just strengthening the governance within cooperatives as well for them to become more inclusive.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, there was one of the topics, I think this was in the original, not a write-in, but engaging the private sector, which could include co-ops as well, or would include co-ops as well, to shape more inclusive agriculture market or food systems. Anyone else? So we've heard this idea of engaging schools, particularly secondary and vocational technical, how to get employers more involved with looking at competencies and getting a better match. We talked about the missing middle and how to maybe begin to increase activity around things like food processing and value addition. So moving up the value chain a little bit. And we talked about highlighting USAID's private sector engagement plans and the connecting subsistence farmers to co-ops or to the private sector to become more inclusive. Do any of those have a bit more interest than another? Something I'd like to take forward?
It would seem that the one that pulls from USAID's private sector engagement, it would allow us to maybe frame, or whoever takes us on as a topical area, the broader, getting to know that better, to know all those elements that fit under it. So.
Okay. Okay. Do we have any volunteers who would be willing to work on taking this one forward? Aparna? Great, thank you. Anyone else? Okay, well, I'm not seeing anybody else jump in there, but we can start with Aparna, and we may be able to find, I think there probably is some broader interest, so I'm sure we could probably find a second person to work with you on that, Aparna. Okay, Mark, do you want to?
Yeah, absolutely. So Jenny asked if we could put the 4 topics in the chat, and I listed them there. So hopefully that helps you to think about which ones you might be particularly interested in. The third one is safe and nutritious food systems. And first of all, I wanted to open it up and just allow you to let us know any thoughts that this brings to mind for you, or anything in this area that's particularly of interest to you. And I've got a couple of potential directions that we could take it in as well, in case we don't have any ideas right immediately. But please go ahead. Any thoughts?
Sorry, could you describe again what you mean by safe food systems? Just trying to think of some.
Yeah, so I think that there are perhaps a couple of different directions to take this in. So, well, there's 2 aspects of it really. There's food safety is one area in here, and it's an area that we know is of kind of increasing importance. USAID has been funding some specific work in this area. And then the second is around nutrition and building nutritious food systems. And I think that Genzo, I believe, maybe touched on this a little bit in his thoughts on the missing middle and the role of value addition and processing as we were talking on, I think, the private sector engagement piece. And so so that could be another direction. Some of the things that immediately sprung to mind for me, perhaps something that could be quite timely in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic is the impact of COVID-19 on nutrition. We've obviously seen some pretty dire warnings around the impact on kind of absolute food supply and the potentials for famines in a number of countries that we haven't necessarily seen come to reality at this point. But certainly we do know that that the role of food safety net programs are increasingly important, as well as there seems to be more appetite on the policy side for safety net programs that are particularly focused on food. So that might be a direction that we want to take this in. Some other things could be around USAID's multi-sectoral nutrition strategy. 2018 was their first review of the strategy. It runs until 2024. And so I think that there's probably a second review coming up some point in the near future. That might be another direction that we want to take this in. So there are some ideas around this, both on the food safety side as well as the nutrition.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead. I couldn't see if someone else was speaking. Just picking up on the nutrition piece. I mean, there's several, like you said, multi-sector, these kind of what they were calling development food security awards and now resilience food security awards with the change from the Bureau, and a couple in particular that focus heavily on nutrition. One in Kenya called Naiwiri, and then there's another, well, there's an RFA, I guess, that's about to come out for a big multi-sector program in Madagascar, I believe, that also has a large nutrition component. So that might be something to look at, just as you were saying, part of the food security strategy and this focus on nutrition and some of these large multi-sector awards. There's also that USAID program, Advancing Nutrition. I know Save the Children is involved with that. And so that might be another angle there.
I think it would be also good to look at their information in the training that they're doing on what they're terming nutrition sensitive agriculture, because I think that is going to also be something that might be relevant for folks to be looking at. And it really does dovetail nicely with the nutrition and the food safety piece in the context of climate change. And I think that will be very important for us to be looking ahead at. So.
Excellent. I'm just taking some notes. So Jenny raised the issue of USAID's Food for Peace programming, the development programming, the resilience and food security activities. And I know that probably several of SID's members, as well as other organizations, are kind of key implementers of those programs, and that might be a really interesting place for us to go to get some expertise on this. I think I'm fairly sure that Mercy Corps implements some of those programs as well. So that could be a really interesting direction for us to take for that. Any other thoughts on directions for this topic?
I mean, I think that the other one the linkages to social safety nets, that angle too could be of interest to folks. I'm trying to think. I was just having a conversation the other day. Sorry, brain. About cash transfer, voucher systems, sort of that whole market, through not just like commodities, but food vouchers to stimulate markets. And I have to remember who I was talking to. Sorry, I organize a lot of these events myself. That's why I was asking if there were partnership opportunities, because I'm not sure I could take on leading one for SID. Because I have to do one as part of my regular job about 1 month or so. But let me think a little bit more on this one, because I know we have a lot I could put together for you. Send it in an email.
You touch on something that reminds me of another topic that I haven't heard very much conversation around. USDA's local and regional procurement program was kind of thought of when it first came out as a pilot, but I haven't really heard much discussion about what the learnings have been from that, and how that has helped to inform USDA on the expansion of that program, or to what extent we should be looking at building on that work. So I wonder if there's any interest around that. I mean, maybe, is there anyone in this group who's heard more than I have on those local and regional procurement programs? It sounds like we haven't. Any interest in exploring it a bit further? Do you think that this is a direction that this topic could be taken in, or that it builds on some of the ideas that we've already talked about here? So I think at this point, we've got some ideas around looking at the work that USAID particularly has been doing in their nutrition-based food security programming, the Food for Peace types of programming, as well as the Advancing Nutrition program. And we've also talked about how approaches like nutrition-sensitive agriculture are being integrated into our programs, and potentially, what lessons we're learning from nutrition-sensitive agriculture approaches. So I think that we've kind of got a general idea about a topic, or kind of better defining this topic from those pieces. Anyone particularly interested in fleshing this out a bit further? I think at this stage, okay, excellent, Lisa. So I'll put Lisa down for this. Again, as we mentioned, we can hopefully look at how we can recruit some more people to be involved in organizing these. And if we do find that there is a topic that doesn't get a huge amount of traction, then it's something that we could shelve and maybe pick up at a later date. But thanks very much, Lisa. And I'll hand back over to Sabrina to go through the final topic.
Great, thanks, Mark. See, we're getting a little close to our ending time. So we may not spend as much time on this one, just so we have time to wrap up. But the last one is diversifying rural economies for increased resilience. I think we kind of touched on this actually tangentially through a lot of the other topics. And I see, Genzo, you're nodding. But are there any ideas here on where we'd like to maybe take this, or specific areas that would be of interest?
So this is about diversifying beyond agriculture. Is that the thinking, like off farm or on farm?
Well, I think that's maybe open. I mean, it could be, we could say, you know, it could be, let's look at both. Let's look at how we can diversify rural economies, both still in the agriculture sector, but diversifying, or going beyond the agriculture sector. And it could be looking specifically at, you know, how do we diversify rural economies outside of agriculture or inside? I mean, it could be one or the other, but it could be both.
Yeah, I put a link in there earlier for this, the Scale Award that focuses a lot on this topic, and it's a USAID funded project and some of my colleagues work on. They're not here on the call, but if, you know, I guess I could link them in as well once we sort of narrow down the focus.
Sorry, Jenny, I'm taking some notes and I missed what you were saying there. Could you just repeat that?
I put a link in the chat earlier for the Scale Award, which focuses a lot on this alternative livelihoods and rural, you know, resilient agriculture, both, as you were saying, working in agriculture, but not, or sorry, on farm instead of off farm. They have a great glossary because I get very confused with the terms myself, but about all of those terms there. And so it's in there and I can connect you or whoever ends up working on this with them.
Great, thanks.
Hi, I have a quick question, clarifying question, clarifying for myself. I'm just wondering if we mean, diversifying rural economies can also mean the introduction or more engagement with different types of livelihoods. So for example, aquaculture, and then thinking about climate resilient agriculture as climate resilient aquaculture, as that's becoming more and more pertinent. I don't know if that's a whole separate conversation in itself. I mean, it could be, but maybe that's one way to think about framing it. Is I realize we haven't talked a lot about climate resilience, so that would be great to kind of touch upon, but open to suggestions.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Certainly when you're discussing resilience, that aspect of climate resilience is an important one. And you're right, we haven't mentioned that yet.
It lends itself to the whole conversation about the context in which those communities are in, and definitely climate's going to be a critical one, water resources, all of the environmental aspects of it. I also think it's kind of one of those conversations when you look at, you know, again, it ties back to our conversation earlier about smallholders, you know, and how do we take them from pathways out of subsistence, or what opportunities there are for them to engage in that. So, you know, it really weaves back to what Genzo talked about, missing in the middle, the pieces, you know, the value added opportunities.
Yeah, and also as a suggestion for framing, to build off Lisa's point, but also I think the prior suggestion, but it's not just about like the different programs. I think, you know, talked about like climate issues or water issues, but also, you know, road issues, and mobility becomes a huge issue, and also electricity. So simple things like, okay, I'm going to, you know, become a tailor and have a sewing machine. If the sewing machine breaks or you don't have electricity to use it, then I guess what's the point? So how do you overcome, maybe framing it like, how do you overcome the different challenges that really make it difficult to escape small scale basic subsistence farming?
Okay, I'm seeing the clock tick down. So I think these are some interesting ideas. Is there anybody who'd be willing to work on this one? I have a hard no from Michelle.
I'm happy to work on something else, but I just don't have enough experience to, and I think I have my own biases against this one as well, because I think the challenges are too many.
Sure. Jenny has said that she could not necessarily lead, but support on this one or on the safe and nutritious food systems, but we do need somebody who would be willing to take it forward. Anybody? Okay, well, as Mark said, if we don't get the interest, it may just be that we want to kind of put this on the back shelf for a little bit, or it's possible it may be something that ends up getting integrated, as because we talked about, this does seem to touch on a lot of the things we've already talked about. So no volunteer identified right now. Just a note that Genzo, Mark, I don't know if you saw in the chat, has said that he would be willing to support on topic 1 as well.
Excellent. Thanks very much.
Okay. Mark, do you want to go through the topic planning template quickly?
Absolutely. So we're pretty short on time, but basically this is what I've put up on the screen is basically the form that we complete to organize a topic. So you'd finalize the title. Potential date is not hugely important at this point, but say, for example, if you had ideas of a panelist that might only be available at a certain time, less challenging now, but say, for example, when we were doing in-person events, then there might be somebody coming to DC that might dictate the timing for it. We'll outline the organizers, those people on this call that we've identified for the particular topic. And then the description of the topic is really the important thing to flesh out here. And so we've got some general ideas. We'll populate this here with those general ideas, but the organizers will really be involved in fleshing out that description, as well as identifying what are the learning objectives that we want to get out of this particular event. You'd also provide a description of what format the event would take place. We're somewhat limited with virtual events, and Zoom calls there's only so many different things that we could do. In an in-person event, the format could be quite different, and so that's what you would include there. SID has asked us for the remainder of this year at this point that we are only going to plan virtual events. If something changes later on, then we might be able to change those events, but we're thinking at this point it's all going to be virtual. And then the last piece on here, you would identify the moderator and the panelists for the event, given the kind of traditional structure of a moderated panel event. So that's basically what the organizers will go away and work on. We're going to send this template out to each of you who've identified an interest in organizing each of these topics, and hopefully you can flesh those out, and over the next few weeks we'll be able to see which ones are more firmly developed and start getting them in the calendar for SID, and work on inviting the panelists and moderator and building the plans out for it. We did want to touch on two other things. One was that we wanted to do a bit of brainstorming around potential different types of virtual events, but I think, Sabrina, we're probably out of time for that one, so we can skip that, I think. Do you agree?
Yeah, I would maybe kind of make a pitch that for those people who are working on planning these, although we are going to be limited to virtual events this year, SID has said, think about how you can integrate some other tools to make it more interactive. You're not locked into a panel discussion strictly, although we do use that a lot, but you can use breakout rooms. We have access to whiteboard tools like Zoom, Mural, Google Jamboard, You can integrate polls or quizzes. You can integrate pre-recorded events. So just, as you're doing your plan, think about those other kinds of options. You're not locked into a panel, I guess is what I want to say.
Excellent. Thanks, Sabrina. Two final things from me. One, you see a link in the chat box that Sid has posted for some feedback opportunities for the event. So if you can click on that link and follow that survey, that would be really useful for SID as they continue to try and make even better events. And the last thing is that my term as co-chair of this work group will be completed in July. So we'll be looking for a new co-chair to continue working forward with this with Sabrina over the next 2 years. They're generally a two-year terms. And so if you're interested in being a co-chair, then please reach out to Sid. Paul is the ideal person to speak to. And even if you just email that general events email address that's posted in the chat, I'm sure that they'll be able to get that message through to Paul. He can share with you a job description for that work group co-chair, and hopefully we can have a good transition at the end of my term in July. Thanks very much to everyone for participating in this, and we'll be working with you closely over the next few weeks as we continue to flesh out these topics and hopefully get some of these topics to fruition and have some great events for this coming year. Looking forward to working with all of you on that, and we'll be in more contact sharing that event topic form with you and working through completing all of that information in there. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.